Okay, hello Isaac.
Rabbi, good morning. It's great to see you.
Good to see you. I feel that I originally thought we'd get through this story a little faster, but
hmm
we're coming to, I guess, the most famous ending of the call for Levi, the call of Matthew. So I guess we could just get started.
Yeah, on that note, the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 6, verse 13. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners.
Hey Isaac, why is this verse important for you?
So I looked at this verse, right? So this verse is based on Hosea 6:6, right? For I learned, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. This verse is commonly quoted. I've seen this quoted multiple times in Christian circles where it's a call to extend mercy. Again, there's always a tension between are living a life according to the law, to ethics, or do you show mercy and you don't live in those and don't live according to those laws, according to the prescribed, maybe not laws, maybe the maybe within you don't live according to what will be ideal. And so like this is always a call it's used as, and you want to show mercy, and it's not so much how you live, but it's also about who you are and how you extend yourself to others. So I'm probably bringing all of my Christian theology into this, and looking at this. But then I did look up Hosea 6:6, preparing for our conversation, and that's part of a larger poem, right? And that it's much of a larger lament or poem, or a prayer of some kind, or God saying this, of God expressing Himself, expressing His thoughts through the prophet Hosea. And so I'm intrigued to hear what you have to say, but I'm surprised when they say is go and learn. It's like this is so direct, like the word go and learn, as in he's telling them you don't know what you're doing, you go and learn, as in learn what this means. You haven't learned some of this. It has very sharp words. So I'm also more intrigued to what you have to say and how you look at these verses.
Well, before it get to me, I guess that it sounds like you're saying some form of supersession that this latter thing, namely righteousness or loving kindness or what's happening in your head, is more important than orthopraxy. It's more important than the actions that you do. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying the other way around. So well, when you mean orthopraxy, right? Orthopraxy could be so on multiple levels, right? It's not just living a good life, but then orthopraxy, which is directed towards showing extending mercy to others, extending mercy to those in the margins, extending those who are typically not accepted, or and orthopraxy, which is
And,
focused
and
on
you're
that.
saying you get that from this verse that you're supposed to extend loving kindness to the other, and you're saying that
Yes.
comes from this verse where it
So
says, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice."
yeah, so when I read this, right, it's as if it's not the orthopraxy of the Pharisees. It's you want to show orthopraxy to include the tax collectors and the sinners and the thieves, so that you're
Well,
part
again,
of
I
the
guess we wouldn't call that orthopraxy, right? So usually orthopraxy means a specific kind of action that's prescribed and within the tradition, something along those lines. So I feel like
so
um this is meant to be opposed to that, right? This is saying that orthopraxy should be overridden in the name of loving kindness and mercy and stuff like that.
yeah, but see, but me extending myself to my neighbor, that's a form of my orthopraxy, my extending mercy
So
and
again, I
acting.
think we're just like splitting here. The usual orthopraxy is rooted in some orthodoxy that's like rooted in some codified book of beliefs, like in Judaism, it'd be the Shulchan Aruch. Like, here's how you live, here's your creed, here's your rituals, here's how you deal with family, and it's almost like you could look towards an encyclopedia in order to figure out what to do. So it's not, it's saying like you follow this codified belief system laws in order to accomplish this. So I'm not so I guess like you're saying that it's not codified, but there's an
Yeah.
overarching sense.
So when we say it's not codified, right? Again, there are multiple strands within Christianity. Some would say it's not. It depends on on where we fall. Like if I were to take the conservative brand and then the liberal perspective, let's say for sake of discussion, two different perspectives. The liberal perspective will say that this act of extending yourself is codified. That's there in the scriptures, and this is another element of that where you have to extend yourself in mercy to others and kindness to others, and especially to those in the margins, with tax collectors and sinners, or people who are not typically accepted, who are not typically who typically looked down in society. And then, to your point, there's also the other perspective where, from a conservative perspective, one might look at a way of living, orthopraxy again. So,
So again,
orthopraxy.
let me try again. Maybe for Christianity, it just sounds like you're saying that there's correct belief and correct action. And if someone has correct belief, it will lead to correct action, but there's no orthopraxy, no specific action that's deemed correct action. It's just that if you have the correct beliefs about mercy, otherness, loving kindness, then it'll play out in most likely an antinomian system, but in a way that you're living a good life. So you'll have a orthopraxy worship, but it's only based on the belief. It's not based on the actual action, in the sense that either Judaism or Islam would have the sense that you follow this orthopraxy over this idea of your orthodoxy.
Yeah.
Like your
So
action is more important. I'll give you, there's an example of this book by Menachem Kellner is Do Jews Believe Anything? And in that book, um, you at least have this idea that maybe orthopraxy is more important than orthodoxy. What you believe maybe could be thrown away. Like there's an article written in the last 10 years about this atheist Orthodox Jew. And he's saying that the culture, the halacha, and the laws is what drives me, and that's how I live my life. But what I actually believe is kind of like meaningless in a positivist sense. Like, who cares what I believe or don't believe? But I think what you're saying, at least how I'm understanding, is that the orthodoxy is more important than the orthopraxy. The belief system leads to action, and how it plays out, plays out. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, like this, it starts with the belief system, right? So I'd also argue that there's no one view in Christianity. There are just multiple. Christianity is not saying this is the only way, and so there are just multiple dominant strands of Christianity which pick out different beliefs, different aspects of the belief system, and from that they flow different practices. Yeah. So
Okay, so
I'm having a hard time
well,
picking out
I
just.
think we're on the same page. And I guess the question is, let's look at Jesus. I know we put a lot of hats on Jesus. Let's look at Jesus as our exegete, as our hermeneutical master for a moment. And let's imagine he's getting this from Hosea 6:6. Is this a good read of that? Is this something that he's trying to argue is what Judaism ought to be going forward? Or especially Hosea lived so long. It was a 6th century BC prophet, I believe, right? So if he's arguing that this is what Hosea advocated, usually I feel like again, 6th century or maybe even 8th century, somewhere, King Yerovam the second lived sometime in the 8th century. So anyways, um, unclear, but probably 8th century BC. So uh, is it that Jesus, as a hermeneutist, hermeneutical master, is saying that Hosea 800 years before, 750 years before, was saying this is what religion ought to be, and therefore I'm implementing it? Is he arguing that Hosea mentioned this, and Ezekiel mentioned the importance of offerings, so I'm choosing Hosea the prophet over Ezekiel the prophet? Or is he saying a third option is that there's just a change now? So let's go through the three options are this is how it was supposed to be 750 years ago. The Jews just doing the wrong thing for 750 years. Because don't forget, like in the 5th century BC, they rebuilt the temple, and Jesus is living during the time of the Herodian temple. So this is what it was 750 years ago. They missed the point for 750 years. One option. Second option is there's different perspectives, different times. Hosea said this, and Ezekiel said this, and every verse has its moment in time. Sometimes you have to focus on loving kindness and mercy, and sometimes you have to focus on offerings, and therefore you see different perspectives in the prophets. And our third option would be I'm using my hermeneutic license, Jesus says, to say this is how it should be going forward. So those are three options. So what do you think about those as three options?
Yeah, so firstly, right, so Matthew does not so Matthew only references a portion of Hosea 6:6. When you look at the verse in Hosea 6, it's a much larger verse. It also includes a second portion, which
That
is
that
which
the
is not
strengthens the argument, right?
which
If
is
you
not
got rid
which
of
is
all the stuff I don't. Yeah.
which is not included, right? And so I think I'm leaning towards the third option, right? Of he saying here's a new way of doing it again. So
So
it's
so
not
I
to say
think I think that's what all Christians would say. So I'm happy you're jumping on the bandwagon. So I think that every Christian would say, I don't care what they are doing in the 8th century BC or how the Jews were keeping commandments or not. All that, it was just meant to foreshadow Jesus coming. It's worthless to me. So Jesus is saying that I'll cite a verse that tells me and you how to live as good Christians. But if I don't have a verse, I'll still tell you. I don't need Hosea in order to prove my point. But if I have Hosea 6:6 to prove my point, wonderful. Go team. That seems like an amazing thing. So it's interesting. If Hosea is meant to be understood as we're saying right now, I feel that we do have a little bit of a question or a contradiction with the answer with Matthew 5:17, where he says, I didn't come to abolish the law of Moses, the writings of the prophets, nor I come to
fulfill the
accomplish
law.
their purpose. So I came to accomplish their purpose. So I feel that we would read that now when it says, I didn't come to abolish the law, what he really means is, I came to abolish the law. And at the end of the verse, it says, I came to accomplish their purpose. Their purpose is antinomianism, to say that that's how they used to live. Let's throw it away and let's go and now use Hosea 6:6 as a precedent for putting loving kindness and mercy and caring about the other as the priority in the hierarchy of choosing how to act. And therefore, when choosing how to act, we should choose good belief that leads to good action, as opposed to relegating belief to either equal to action or even secondary to action. And in Jewish sources, we have the same question. A lot of times we have this very famous phrase I see all the time where it says, what's the point of learning? Learning to lead to action. And learning definitely could be a substitute for belief, because the learning is meant to indoctrinate you and inculcate you with certain ideological underpinnings. So is a point of action to have good belief or vice versa, or they work hand in hand? So it sounds like, at least in Matthew 5:17, when it says, I did not come to abolish the law, I would reread it as, I came to abolish the law in its literal sense that's found in the writings and the prophets and the Torah and other place, because the law, being a legalistic thing, is meaningless. But I've come to accomplish their purpose, which is what Moses always wanted to do, which was the reason for the commandment. And the reason for the commandment is to promote loving kindness, mercy.
Rabbi,
And
amen.
go
You
with
made
that.
that's a great homily. That's right. So
Oh, great homily. Okay. Is it Sunday? No.
I came to abolish
Well,
the, I
again, this
came to,
this is all part of our third way to read the past. So let me just to go forward, let me put the past into historical context. So when you read Deuteronomy, when you read Leviticus, when you read Exodus, there's definitely a focus on offerings. And what I would like to do to start is just look at maybe the three most famous places that we see this attitude of Hosea 6:6 manifest in other places in the prophets in the Tanakh. So first, if you have your local Bible in front of you, just flip to Isaiah 1:11. And I'll just read I'm gonna skip around because I'm gonna skip the Hebrew, and I'll only read the parts of the verse that are meaningful for this conversation. Though obviously it's better to look for it in its historical context and its in the context of the verse. So in Isaiah 1:11 in English, it says, "What need have I of all your sacrifices, says God? I am sated with burnt offerings of rams," and it goes on and on, all different things. He goes, I'm good. So this is another what I think we would call the anti-sacrifice perspective. And I think if you look close at Matthew 9:13, it actually doesn't say the legalisms. It could have said the commandments. In Hebrew, it could have said the mitzvos. But what it says is the sacrifices, by quoting Hosea. And this attitude is also manifest in Isaiah 1:11. Also, if you skip 16 verses and just go to 1:17, you get to the point which parallels Hosea's 6:6. And it says, learn to do good, devote yourself to justice, aid the wrong, uphold the rights of the orphan, defend the cause of the widow. So that's Isaiah, which we have a parallel to Hosea. Now we're going to skip to Jeremiah 7, 21 to 23. We'll read all three of these verses. It says, so said God, the God of Israel, add your burnt offerings to your other sacrifices and eat the meat. I don't care about it, aka. For when I freed your ancestors from the land of Mitzrayim from Egypt, I did not speak with them or command them concerning burnt offerings sacrifices, aka I don't really care about that stuff so much. But this is what I commanded them: do my bidding, that I may be your God and you may be my people. Walk only in the way that I enjoin you, and that it may go well with you. Generally, people quote this verse also as a parallel Hosea 6:16. I don't see it as much. I see it as do legalisms, but don't worry so much about sacrifices. The third verse from Micah 6:6, which is also famously quoted as I think another one. There's a lot of these, but there's a third example of the anti-offering perspective, where Micah 6:6 says, with what shall I approach God? Do homage to God on high. Like, how should I do that? Shall I approach with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Because that's how old a lot of the offerings are. Would God be pleased with thousands of rams, with myriads of streams of oil? Because oil they'd also offer with these offerings. Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for my sins? You have been told, O mortal, what is good. Of what God requires of you? Just as good. Only do justice, do love good, and to love goodness, and to walk modestly with my ways. So listen, we can multiply these kind of examples, and we can multiply the examples that are the opposite, where they say you got to just do the legalisms. So I feel that this attitude of anti-sacrificial cult that we see at least manifest in Isaiah and Hosea and Jeremiah and Micah and other places is something that is really interesting when you look at it from the historical precedents about what is Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, Hosea trying to accomplish. So I think early Christians would have been like, this is something that, yes, Jesus has some point of replacement theology, but it's also kind of viewed, tell me if you disagree, it's viewed as like a primitive ritual. If a Christian was to offer sacrifice today, or let's say you got a good literalist, a good Seventh-day Adventist, or another person in the Christian community who will be literal about their interpretation of the 6 days or anything else in the Bible, and they say, "Well, I should go and go offer sacrifices." So I think most Christians would say that's a horrible idea. Even if you're evangelical or fundamentalist, you're not going to be evangelical fundamentalist about bringing offerings in the temple, amongst other things.
Well,
So
that's the whole premise of the book of Hebrews, right? I mean, when you read the Hebrews, I mean, still sacrifices are offered, but this is Christ offered his life as a sacrifice. And so I think from a Christian perspective, offering sacrifices would go backwards. Like, why would you like that's already
right,
done?
it's interesting. Hebrews for me, it's also, when Jesus is shown in Hebrews to be like better or superior to angels, prophets, and lesser claims of truth. And like his sacrifice is viewed as the top level, the nadir of the temple sacrifices. I'm always surprised when you see that in like comparison to what we see in Acts, because we see Peter and Paul still worship in Acts chapter 3 and Acts 21, that Peter and Paul are still worshiping and offering sacrifices at the Beth Mikdash of the temple. So this idea of supersessionism that we see in Hebrews is a little bit hard, I think, to work out with Acts. But yeah, definitely, I would say later Christian writings, say rooted in Hebrews and else, definitely sees Jesus as offering a better life for humanity through his own salvation. And the Mosaic Law, anything that's found of the 613 commandments, is the past. And if anything, for me, as I mentioned before, that the idea that literalists or fundamentalists are so selective about, I take the 6 days of creation as literal, but I don't take the commandments of pig literal. And to me, it's very difficult to find the algorithm for how you should replace some things and not other things, unless you argue that good belief leads to good action, and whatever they're doing, it becomes automatically good. And this is one of the things that I think is a little bit difficult, because when you think of good action leads to good belief, you have then those Presbyterians, right, who think like the that you become wealthy off that. because that's proof that good action believe it's good belief. And I think it's very difficult. So I feel like if I asked you, Isaac, so I hope that you believe properly in Christian religion, and therefore, how would you know in any given situation without a code what good action is based on that good belief?
That's a difficult
Because
answer.
that's the foundation that you're arguing right now. So
Yeah.
I mean, we'll go back to the argument of the offerings, but if I ask you, so how do you know? And again, like to say that I'm outsourcing my morality to a code book is not much better. I'm not arguing that the Jewish perspective of like just saying let's look it up and not to internalize the message is inherently better. But I do think that when you have different denominations of Christians, we both know that the Methodist Church recently split over the LGBT issues. So let's imagine both of them have good belief. The Methodists and mostly in America who are the pro-LGBT community versus the Methodists in Africa and the rest of the world who are anti. So they have both good belief, but it leads to opposite actions. So let's imagine you want to be a good Christian, and let's say you believe with all your heart. You are top 10 star of believing in Jesus. Like, how would you decipher good action when you look at all the thousands and thousands of Christian denominations who not only say to worship God differently, but they also they also ban and put into cherem and
Yeah.
ostracize other groups. So
Yeah.
it's so hard. I feel like the system like it has to give way somewhere. It's hard to figure out what to do.
Yeah, Rabbi, I think this is where, so even as you looked at Matthew, right, Jesus is very ambiguous. He's not always clear. There are places
Oh,
where
is he?
say, follow me, don't follow me, go do this thing. And so I don't think Christianity says there's just one
Well,
way of
why do you
doing
think
it.
he is? Isaac, why is he ambiguous? Because
That's a
I
great
agree.
question.
I agree. When we read that line earlier, and he said, "Those who are well have no need of physician, but those who are sick, they do." I was
Yeah,
like, "That's the most Jesus thing I've ever heard." It's such a good parable. It feels like something that came out of his mouth more than almost anything else in Matthew. But also, you and I argued about what it meant for the next 20 minutes because
yeah.
there's this inherent ambiguity.
Yeah, so I think it's just thinking out loud, right? In some ways, he was subversive in the sense that Judaism might have, as you said, this orthopraxy, the codified laws, the 613 laws you keep, and he was pointing to a different way. Like you said this way more eloquently of the purpose of Moses is they not so much the it's not so much the legal aspects of this. He was pointing to a way that involved love and trust. I mean, he speaks about the Holy Spirit later
You know,
on.
I guess these things are just so foreign for me. It's like when you say these things, I would say I try to be merciful, I
Mhm.
try to be loving, but you're speaking them as a supersession level that they are to the exclusion of the other things. And if anything, I say do both. I don't. I guess one of the I don't know if the right word is criticism, but when I hear this, I'll quote I don't know the 36 times that the Pentateuch says that you should take care of the stranger, the 24 times it says you should take care of the widow. Like how many times it says love your neighbor. Like you have all these things, and on top of those things, you have commandments. So in my world, either they're supposed to live side by side or they're supposed to build into another. But this idea that we possibly see in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, Hosea, this idea of supersession that we see in Hebrews is something that I guess like when I look at it, I just don't know why they shouldn't exist side by side. And when we do see sometimes Christian law books, they're rare because good belief should lead to good action. Okay, anyway, so I think this is a great question. We'll go back to the question a little bit. I just want to go and talk about this because Jesus wants our verse today. It says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. So I guess I want to ask you if you ever thought about when we look at slavery today, one of the main criticisms that people have of the Bible, I find today, is that it has what I would call a pro-slavery attitude.
Mhm.
People have different levels of how pro it is and independent. The Bible is not against slavery. That's a good way to say it. So, additionally, the Bible is not against saying what would be considered homophobic beliefs. And the thing that I think that we could add to the criticism that we see of the Pentateuch is this idea of the sacrificial cult. People look at slaughtering a cow for the sake of worship of God as disgusting today. Like, how ridiculous. because you might say we have like either a modern attitude towards God or an enlightened attitude, but they say like let's be more like Hindus. Like, look at the bulls, let them be a metaphor for things, let them be something that we value all life. But the idea of that God wants its blood, it seems so against a modern attitude that it feels that even if we're being anachronistic and we superimpose that attitude to 800 years ago, it still feels authentic to a eternal religion to reject the sacrificial cult, right? And I think
Mhm.
when Christians in the first century had a really convenient situation that what happened in 70, the temple is destroyed. So even though we see that in Acts that Peter and Paul went, that's a problem. I wish they didn't, right? I think Christians are annoyed that they would have loved to see that Jesus died and then the Beit Midrash, the temple, was completely ostracized and people completely saved. That would have been better for Christianity. But putting aside those 30 or 40 years between when Jesus died and when the temple is destroyed, and looking at those years as saying that putting those 30, 40 years aside, at least the temple is destroyed because it might have been a primitive ritual, but even if it's not, it's something that we as Christians, that the Christian community say, we don't need it anymore, putting aside Paul and Peter in Acts being there. So let's look at Hebrews as our foundation. So if I ask you now, if viewing as contemporaneously backwards, it maybe is viewed as in the first century as backwards. So why would it ever exist? Like, why, what was the goal? If I asked you, like, okay, you're gonna just be studying Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and even don't Noah made a sacrifice, a bunch of extra animals were brought on the ark. So if you read any of the books of the Pentateuch and you go straight through the Tanakh, you're gonna see sacrifice is such an important thing. So what's its meaning to you?
Yeah, so Rabbi, these are all profound questions I had not thought before. So when you say Peter and John, right, even Paul, right, even Paul went back to the temple. That's why he was in prison. He was caught because he wanted to be at the temple at the Jewish Passover.
Even
And so
better
when
if it's destroyed in 40. Better for
you,
Christians.
and so when you say I didn't connect the dots. At the moment I say temple, that does involve sacrifice, right? So
Yeah,
um,
yeah. That's what do you think they're doing there? Barbecue.
yeah, so, but I think this is where, right, as Christianity grew, as Gentiles were brought in, it took on a different flavor. I don't think that the disciples had a rule book of, okay, we do this and this and this. They had to learn, navigate some of this, as in somebody lived, died, rose again, what this means. And so, looking back, I don't think they had, okay, here's a game plan. Now that this happened, we'll change all this. As
It's
Christianity grew,
complicated, right? Yeah.
other people came, they adapted, changed the way of thinking. Even with Paul, some of his thinking, it's been there's refinement in his thinking over the years. And so, and I really cannot speak to, again, this
Right.
is the world we are right now. It's changed. We've come in different ways. It is now. But to your point, right, there are portions where it can sound as though they permit slavery, right? And so, um, yeah. So
Okay,
we
so let
always.
me give you a little background of sacrifices. Maybe that will help you. And like again, maybe you'll come to a conclusion, maybe won't. So in Judaism, I think there's two medieval strong beliefs about the nature of sacrifices and what they're important for. So the most famous is Maimonides, Rambam. He says in his Guide for Perplex that in short, sacrifices are meant to wean you off from idolatry. In short, Judaism, being a religion based in Aramean lands in the Levantine and in Egypt, the Jews were influenced by different cultures and become accustomed to this ritualistic dependency on ritual, that they needed to do ritual. How do you worship God? Well, what should you do? So when you do loving kindness to a person, are you worshiping God in that moment, or are you living your life properly? And this is an important distinction. If the way to worship God is to just do loving kindness to your neighbor, then your neighbor is just a tool. Your neighbor is literally the other. Your neighbor is not a human being then. It's a tool for you to get into heaven. And it's almost like there's this idea in Judaism that we say blessings and everything, but when you give charity, you don't give you don't say a blessing because you can't use a human being as a tool. End of the day, whenever you give charity, you're kind of saying like, are you doing it to help the person, or on the other hand, are you doing it to make sure that you're worshiping God? So this is one of the problems. So people in the when the Bible was given and in the centuries around then, they didn't have a way to worship God, especially if you view negative theology as a way that to understand God, or if you view the fact that there's really no God is so the other. There's such rational monotheism to such a level that there's no really way to relate to the Godhead, you get stuck. And what happened is that Maimonides says in the Guide for Plex 332, the familiar mode of worship, the way of life grew up in, prevalent throughout the world in those days, just meant sacrificing various animals in temples where those images were erected, bowing down to them, burning incense before them. The pious and devout in those days worshipped only in temples dedicated to the stars. So while the wisdom and grace evident throughout creation, God did not decree that his law simply annul, reject, and abolish all such worship because they won't be able to handle it. So the way to be a good person is to do ritual because there's no other way to kind of worship God when God's like this invisible, magical being. So that's the famous Maimonides argument. Ramban, Nachmonides, took issue with this. And he says, well, we see that Noah made offerings. We know that Abraham made offerings. How can you say it's just a response and we're trying to wean people off of this idolatrous practice? We see that it's inherent in nature. The way to worship God is through offerings. So if you look at Nachmanides, the idea of supersession is ridiculous. The reason that Noah gave offerings wasn't because he was commanded. It says God liked the smell. It's because the way to worship God is through offerings. And if you think that the way that Abraham went and did a covenant of God, the way to was he cut the animals in half. And so Maimonides, I think the Christian tradition is rooted more in the rejection of this Nachmanides tradition and rooted more in the Maimonides tradition. Because Maimonides says you're weaning people off it. So let's imagine you get to Jesus in the first century, and there's no like we still have this sacrificial cult, but we understand in our modern Roman, Greek, Hellenistic ways that it doesn't make sense to offer sacrifices. That's a relic of the past. Let's move forward. The weaning process that Maimonides said started at the theophany, at the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, came to a conclusion in the first century. There's historical proof that the temple was destroyed. And the second, you have metaphysical proof because that's when Jesus lived. So that's would be the Christian argument. But I think once you take that argument, which I think is a good Maimonidean argument about like, well, the weaning process was done. It took 1,200 years or however long. The problem that you get with that is what I asked you before. So what do you do? Are people just tools? Is the I thou relationship always that you're a thou, you're a you, and I'm a me? Do we look at like Bishop Barclay and say it's just me in the world and everyone is just a pawn in order for me to carry out the world? Loving kindness becomes what we'd say in Hebrew, lo lishma. It becomes something that it's not for his own sake. Because you can't help someone if you think that the main reason you're helping them is because you're going to heaven. When you help them, you're not helping them. Who are you helping? You're helping yourself. So this idea of loving kindness becomes problematic in a post cult sacrifice cult way. So much so that when you get people who have skepticism or some form of Nietzscheism at the root of their philosophy, someone who will look at like a Kantian ethics like Yeshayahu Leibowitz, he'll say, okay, you're weaned off it, but now what should you do? How can you be a good person? What is the actions that you need to take? And he goes, ritual at its first level is pagan, it's ridiculous, it doesn't make sense to do it. But once you get to the deeper level and you realize it doesn't make sense, then you realize that the only thing that makes sense is the ritual. So this is one of Yeshayahu Leibowitz's main arguments about the nature of commandments, because you live in a physical world. If you told me as a Christian that you became, once you had the highest belief in God, you became an angel, and you just popped out of existence, that would make sense, because the physical world becomes this impediment to you, because you can't really do loving kindness at the highest level. So Yeshayahu Leibowitz, Isaiah Leibowitz, he just takes care of that by saying there's nothing matters in the world. So the only way that you can really worship God and a God who's completely separate is by arbitrarily, maybe even choosing what to do is nice. So I guess I'll go back to you and say, when the verse says, go and learn what this means, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Can one really be merciful and loving kindness if that good belief is not leading to good action in a concrete sense, but in a subjective sense, where you're choosing every day and where you have these thousands of Christian denominations and you have almost like this anarchy, this cacophony of good action that we don't know how to lead to good belief.
Yeah, Rabbi, that's a lot you've covered, right? And so, speaking of actions and using people as actions, right? This is where Jesus also had this famous commandment: you should love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself. And
Oh,
so, so that in a way, so
I think, are we going to switch to Mark 12? That's
No,
what
no,
we're
no,
going.
yeah, yeah, right. So I think that there is lots to unpack in that, right? But even we speak of mercy, right? It is subjective. There is no like mercy means different things in different contexts. It's not just subjective feeling. And sometimes the feelings can lead to action, and sometimes it might not. And I think in that the Bible is vague. It doesn't say like here's exactly what you have to do. It gives a few broad guidelines, like he says, go desire mercy and not sacrifice. And to your point, does that mercy really mean involve some particular action? Is it action at all times, or are there instances when you feel mercy, but maybe the best thing is not to act? And so I don't have a clear answer, and this is where I think wisdom is again within the Christian faith. Wisdom, discernment, prayer becomes a part of it because it's less a prescription. He tells you here's a map, like here's a map, and figure the stuff out, and like go do some of like you'll have to experiment, run a few experiments to learn how all these work. At least that's my initial take on it. I barely find a clear prescription on you do this and don't do that, and you know things we can check off a list.
So I feel like just because you mentioned the order, it's interesting when you look at Mark 20, 12:29. So that's when the Pharisee scribe was asking Jesus what the greatest commandment is in the Mosaic law. So it obviously is a loaded question, but it's interesting how he doesn't just say, love your neighbor as yourself. There's no commandment greater than that. He says that, but he says that second. Because second, he says, first he says, love your neighbor with all your heart and all your soul, with all your mind, all your strength. So first he says the Shema. So it's interesting about how he even puts that in perspective about how one should be a good person, how one should act. It seems to me the first of all commandments, he focuses on monotheism. If anything, uh, what comes out of monotheism? I guess, is this also good belief? So again, it's just like, I don't mean the sidebar, but it's a good question about how Jesus answers in Mark 12, 29 to 31, how he says, first the Shema, love God, monotheism. And then he says, love God
Lo-
love God with
love
all your
your
heart. And
love
then
your
he makes a
neighbor.
point. And then second, love your neighbor as yourself. There's no commander greater than these. So I think that sets up this controversial reality. Like he was asked the question and he gave an ambiguous answer. I guess that's a good way to say it.
Yeah, so he gave a broad outline, but in terms of how this plays out in action, it involves discernment, right? It involves it's not always clear cut. Again, when you look at each situation, it's not always very clear. Anyway, so that we got a bit sidetracked by that, but I liked how you framed it. So you're saying back to early discussion, right? So uh, what do from a Christian perspective, I think we would want to say that Christ changed, that he made the ultimate sacrifice. There is no more need of sacrifice. But you bring up great points on, with great points on sacrifice.
Yeah, and just to conclude, I made it sound like there's this dichotomy between Judaism and Christianity. The truth is, Judaism, there's no more offerings. There's endless midrashic lines that say that how do you bring a sacrifice today? You just read the text, and that's good enough. And we have the very famous line from Avot the Rabbi Nassan, which says, "There's no more temple." So what do you do? He goes, "My son, do not be grieved. We have another atonement as effective as temple sacrifices." And what is that? Acts of loving kindness, as it said, "For I desire mercy and not sacrifice," from Hosea 6:6. So you even have in a rabbinic tradition this idea, well, we don't have offerings. It must be the will of God from a historical perspective. We don't have offerings. So what should we do today? Loving kindness. So I just thought I'd finish that because I would say that exactly parallels the Christian tradition and even quotes the same verse.
So back to earlier to initial question, right? You gave us three options, and I lean towards the third option, Jesus saying something new. So now are you saying that when we look at all these verses, so
Well,
was
this
he just
rabbinic text would probably have been written after Jesus lived. So a lot of times I'll say Christianity followed Judaism. I'm happy to say in this one that maybe Judaism followed Christianity on that because I feel that Judaism was ripped apart with the destruction of the temple and further ripped apart with the Bar Kokhba revolt and 50 years later, that there was a process of healing and trying to figure out what it means to be a Jew in exile.
Mhm.
So with sacrificial cult. And You have to double down on prayer probably. You probably have to double down on acts of loving kindness, and you probably have to double down on ritual. All these aside from the sacrificial cult. So I think that this line from Avot de Rabbi Nassan, where he says acts of loving kindness from Hosea, he's viewing it from that perspective that, well, we don't have a temple. Don't worry, there's still a way to get the equal atonement,
Hmm.
and that is by being a good person.
Hmm.
Okay.
And thank you for this question. I had not thought why Peter and John and Paul will go back to the temple if they,
Uh,
why they were so. Okay, well,
Acts
Rabbi,
Acts 3 and Acts
uh,
21. Go check it out.
okay, Rabbi. On that note, thank you. It's
No
always
problem.
great,
Okay, speak soon.
great learning. Thank you.